Officially, good morning. This is one in a series of our risk management sessions for this year. And this is going to be focusing on the differences between the San Francisco and the CAR contracts. And Matthew is here. I'm here. My focus tends to be on the San Francisco contract. Matthew has graciously dove into the CAR contract. And so we're prepared to talk about both of them today.
Just covering the objective, basically we're going to try and work out the differences between the two contracts. Randall's disclosure, we're not attorneys. This is from the broker's opinion. So kind of like we're just trying to make sure that you're all up to speed on these things.
And I'll also add in that even if you consult an attorney, attorneys have varying opinions. This stuff is not black and white. It's not absolute. There's no absolute right answer on some of the questions that you might have, but we can give opinions and experiences and what we've experienced in the past with attorneys involved in a dispute.
Yeah, and if you're doing CAR, particularly if you have a question on that, you can actually call the legal hotline from CAR. Just word of advice for that, when you're going through the key code system, just select that you're not representing a buyer, you're not representing a seller, you just got a simple question on the contract and you get through and the attorney comes on, so they don't have to reach out to the other party, and you can ask the information on the contract and they give you a really good response. And if you don't quite get it, they talk with you until you do.
So, and I usually agree with the CAR attorneys.
I don't always agree with them.
Not all the time.
But they did write it, so I suppose so.
Well, some of them are just part of that answering team, and they understand the contract, they've reviewed the contracts, but they also may be kind of new to the process and may not have the same opinion that another attorney would have.
Yep. Okay.
Okay.
So why are we doing this? I suppose so. So if you're Marin or East Bay, or you occasionally write office in San Francisco, or you're Marin agents and you occasionally come here. So this is kind of what this is really all about. And then sometimes we have out of area agents who bring offers to us. So both ways. So it doesn't matter either way. Out of area listing agents may ask for a non-San Francisco contract in San Francisco. So we want to be careful about that.
I want to be prepared for that.
Yeah. And if you're a San Francisco agent and you're selling a property outside of San Francisco, you'll need to use the CAR forms, and you need to understand that. And that's where we're trying to work out the analysis so you don't end up putting yourself in a bad position, or your seller or buyer in a bad position.
The good news is that the contracts are basically very, very similar. There are some differences which we're going to be talking about, but the idea is to outline the terms of a sale of a property. And so there's a whole lot of similarities, but we'll talk about the differences. Okay, so some things to watch out for. And I will mention that in dealing with this, we kind of have to have a starting point. So the starting point is the CAR contract. And then we're going to talk about how that differs from SFAR.
Okay. So again, these are the things that are really kind of the same between all the contracts. They're all trying to do the same intention.
So how we're going to pay for it and how much we're going to pay is the same. Boilerplate design with defaults is there. So to achieve a generic product, one of the things about the CAR contract is that it covers the entire state, with the exception of a couple of counties, one of which is San Francisco. And one of the things that is also, which we'll probably mention again, that is of interest, is that the regulations in San Francisco is a city and county. And so everything is the same throughout San Francisco. If you get into Marin, as an example, that's not necessarily true. You go from one town or city to another, and the local ordinances may differ. And so the generic product of the CAR contract is set up so that it refers to any local governmental requirements, for instance. And that is going to differ from place to place, depending on where you are in the state. In San Francisco, one of the beauties of the San Francisco contract is that it's tailored just to our area, and there are no differences between various locations in the city because they're all in the same city and county.
There's a big one. So we'll go over this a little bit further, but in CAR contract, all the contingencies are bundled together in one section. So one of the things that can happen is it doesn't deal with the rent control. And we'll talk about it further again, but the sellers, if they haven't performed all their duties, it can be potentially impossible to actually serve a notice for the buyers to perform because the seller hasn't already completed their performances. So it's hard to force the buyer into doing something. So if they're missing a 3R report or something like that, it can cause problems. And that's why really in San Francisco, we want to use the San Francisco contract.
And that's a good contract basic, that you can't expect the other party to perform if you have not performed. So one of the things that we deal with when we get into a dispute is before we start demanding that the other party perform, let's make sure that we have fulfilled all of our performance requirements.
Yeah, and I just saw one agent pop up, and yes, so in the peninsula, we also have the PRDS contract. So if you're working down the peninsula, some agents will allow you to use CAR, but if you want to use the PRDS, that's a whole nother question, and come talk to your sales manager.
Yeah, we're not covering that today.
And one of the things Randall already touched on is the local ordinances. They aren't always referenced in the local addenda. So sometimes it's just known that that's what you're going to do in that neighborhood, and everyone expects you to do it, and it just falls under one of the clauses which we'll talk about. So you can have hidden things in there which can really throw a spanner in the works for your buyer or seller if you don't know they're there.
For those of you who are very observant, either watching or here at West Portal, I thought I'd bring up that Matthew and I are both wearing pink shirts today.
Not planned. Okay.
Looks very pretty. Imagine the early morning phone call.
What are you wearing?
Exactly. So some of the things that are going to be different, there are some things, actually I'll go back. So timeframes. So timeframes in the CR contracts, you've pretty much got, the sellers have got one set of timeframes, predominantly 7 days, and the buyer's default is 17 days. And they're all bundled together. San Francisco contract is very different. So each contingency timeline and responsibility for each section is designated within the paragraph. So it's kind of, in many ways, it's actually easier for sellers and buyers to know exactly what all their performance timelines are.
It's probably more difficult for transaction coordinators, though, because transaction coordinators can look at a CAR contract and tell immediately what the timeframes are for each of the parties involved. With a San Francisco contract, you'd have to actually refer to each paragraph to see, just to make sure. Over time, I'm sure everybody understands what the timeframes are for specific transactional obligations, but that's one of the basic differences in the structure of the contract, is having all of the timeframes and contingencies bundled versus spread out based on tradition in San Francisco.
Yeah. So appraisal contingency, it's a great one for the San Francisco contract.
Yeah, so the San Francisco contract added a paragraph about 10 years ago that allows you to specifically call for an appraisal contingency. And the reason that that was done was to allow for the addition of a paragraph which exists in CAR contract as well, which is non-contingent financing. And the idea was, well, if I decide if I'm a buyer and I decide that I want to have non-contingent financing and offer that to the seller, what if I still want the appraisal, or if I still need to get an appraisal? And so what we did was we added an additional paragraph that allowed to choose to have an appraisal contingency. The way it was before, it was set up so that it was assumed that if you're getting financing, there was going to be an appraiser that was going to do an appraisal on the property. But with non-contingent financing, the whole idea of that is to allow a buyer to say, I'm going to get financing, but it's not a contingency of this contract because I am so sure that I'm going to get the financing. Circumstances might include that I have 50% cash down, and I just know that I've got a good credit rating, so I know I'm going to get financing. It's just a matter of getting the appraiser in to fulfill the lender's requirement. But the lender in San Francisco might say, yeah, we're going to approve your financing, but we feel that the property is 10 or 20% less valuable than the price that you paid. And so if you don't have the appraisal contingency signed in the San Francisco contract, it means that you're willing to make up the difference and take it on whatever the appraisal comes in at. Whereas if you check the box and say, no, it has to appraise at the sale price, then that confirms that you're going to get you're going to have an option to back out of the contract if the appraisal doesn't come in.
Yeah. Well, actually, in the end of that paragraph in SFAR, it also has an option to put a different price than the purchase price.
Yeah.
So you can offer 2.1 million and say, I'm still going to proceed as long as it appraises for 195, because that's the biggest difference that you as a buyer are willing to take on as the difference between the appraisal and your offer price. But if you do financing in San Francisco, it's automatic appraisal is already included in the financing provision.
Right.
And there's a lot of agents who don't understand that. And it's, and I've been on the other side of that where.
So they have a financing contingency and they have the appraisal contingency?
No, just the financing.
Yeah.
But so if you have financing, you intrinsically have an appraisal contingency on the San Francisco contract. It's very different in the CAR contract. I'll read that in a quick second. So in CAR, it is completely separate. So you have a financing provision, but that doesn't mean you have an appraisal condition. You have to actually check the box to say you want to have an appraisal. You can also add the clause if you want to, the same difference. I'm offering 2.1 and I need it to appraise for more than 195, but you would need to write that in. But if you don't, just be aware that for those people who are in San Francisco riding outside, you have to include the separate appraisal condition. You cannot rely on that. Otherwise, you can have contingent financing, but it doesn't matter what the appraisal says. And now you've put yourself or your buyer into a real dilemma.
We got an interesting comment from somebody viewing this. Say you have no financing contingency, but the lender sees the water heater is not strapped or no carbon monoxide detectors. It's a condition of financing. So this is a good point where you put yourself in a pickle if it's not subject to an appraisal contingency, and then the appraiser, unrelated to the price of the property, notices something that may be an issue for the lender.
Right.
Those are ordinances, so it has to be done prior to close.
Well, if it in fact is one of the local ordinances, then
I see in the code.
then that would, you're right, that would fall under another term of the contract. But if there's no specific call out, I mean, for what was mentioned here, which is carbon monoxide detectors and water heater strapping, those are part of the contract. And so you're right, that would fall under another term of the contract. So that's a good point. And then I have another comment. Can sellers say, hey, you have no financing contingency, you, the buyer, need to pay for that? Well, they could say that you need to pay for the difference between the sale price and the purchase price, but that's the only thing that the appraisal contingency could be used for, to try to force a buyer to pay for something.
So we talked about item 4, which is the appraisal condition in San Francisco. No rental property paragraph on the CAR form. So there is an additional form, but it actually states in the CAR form that if you cannot provide the property vacant due to rent control, that the contract may not be valid. It actually states that in the contract.
Isn't that like the, again?
So if there's one thing to say, be careful of, when you're using the CAR contract in San Francisco or anywhere where there's rent control in a couple of places in the North Bay, there's rent control in a couple of places in the East Bay. You have to be very careful because the contract calls for the property to be vacant at close of escrow. And then states that if you can't provide it empty at close of escrow, then it may not be enforceable. So
right. So I mean, I think the different areas, so the East Bay, the North Bay, and other areas that are getting more and more rent control, they're going to have to start writing stronger addenda, which covers this and cancels out that clause. But I don't see any local addenda yet that I've noticed that where it actually removes the clause from the contract. And I think they should, but in San Francisco, we've already dealt with it in our contract.
One of the things we were talking about before we started this session today, Matthew and I were talking about the two contracts and saying that the revisions have been coming fast and furious. San Francisco had a revision in March and then had another revision in April. So within 30 days, there was a fresh revision of the contract. You have to be very careful. Of course, in zip forms, you're going to be using the latest contract, but you have to keep orienting yourself to the changes to the contract.
Yes, if you're using global templates, please don't make your own templates. If you're going to use for the contracts, use the global template. And then if there's other favorite forms that you have, okay, create your own site template. But remember, you have to go and manually update the forms in your own templates. So, even today we were going over and, we ended up, one of us had a contract from March and the other one had the contract from April. So it's really easy to do. So,
Marcia.
So regarding rental property on the CAR form, would it be best if it is rental property to use an addendum to remove that clause from the CAR contract?
Well, there actually is a San Francisco addendum to the CAR contract, and which does incorporate rent control items to it. Do you want to speak to that, Matthew?
I can. Yeah. Well, there is some about, you can have tenants. You can buy a property that's tenant occupied. It's whether it's in rent control. So there is a separate addendum you can add into the CAR contract for San Francisco if that's what you really, really have to do. And that can happen sometimes in the probate because you have to use the CAR probate contract. So you want to then, and if it's tenants occupied, bring in that addendum. But it covers many things, and it does cover some things about rent control and protected tenants. But what it also does, again, it still brings it into that bundle of the buyer's investigation period all together. So you don't get an individual timeline of 5 days to remove something. The buyer may still have that 17 days, or if the seller hasn't provided tenant estoppels, which in the San Francisco contract clearly states that the seller only has to supply the estoppels if and when the tenants have provided them. In the San Francisco contract, it's saying you have to provide the tenant estoppels to the buyers. And if the tenants don't provide it to you, you, the seller, haven't performed, and now you haven't performed, you can't actually make the buyers remove their conditions.
That's for the CAR contract,
That's
not for the
CAR.
SFAR contract.
SFAR just allows the fact that we know tenants don't provide it, but the CAR version of the contract addendum does not put that in. So again, it's a conflict in San Francisco, and it's just making possible for your buyers to potentially, depending on which attorney you talk to, get out of the contract.
All right. What else? Yes, supplemental disclosures on the CAR contract are not considered default. So you have to kind of really check on the local addenda and the statewide addenda what you want to incorporate into the contract. So in San Francisco contracts, they're literally all listed out paragraph by paragraph what the seller's responsible to do. CR, it is not. So you need to, again, make sure that you're adding in under item 5, 5A and 5B. Check the glasses there. Yeah, it's all the different sellers advisories, the different local addenda you may have to add in. So there is boxes for other. And so if you're in the East Bay and you have an Oakland addendum or a Berkeley addendum, or you have something that's in Mill Valley, you need to check that box and state which ordinance you want to bring in or what addendum you want to bring in. Obviously, if you provide it with a contract at the time, it's going to be considered presented at that point, but it is much better to check the box and reference to it. All right.
Oh, money.
My last 3 deals in Berkeley have had the buyers having to cover the clearance for the water conservation ordinance. In other words, they have to update the appliances, and they have to go to the city within 6 months or a year or whatever and actually comply that. Can you just stick that back on them by countering that out, or how would you handle that in this context?
So the question, we should repeat the question. The question has to do with when a buyer asks for when the seller is asking for the buyer to deal with water conservation ordinance, then the question is, can you counter that out? Yeah, you can change any term that you want to, mutually agreeable between the parties, as long as it's legal under local codes and ordinances. But yeah, you could say, no, we're not willing to do that. You got to deal with it yourself. And I think that in most areas, the laws are set up so that the seller complies prior to transfer of sale. Not all the time, but you'd want to check and see what the local ordinance is.
I know in Berkeley, it is an option to push it back to the buyer if you want to do it. It's the same with the sewer lateral in Berkeley.
Yeah.
But if you do the sewer lateral in that scenario in Berkeley, then the buyer has to put up a bond paid through escrow, which gets sent to the city, and then the work has to be done. You have to have the sewer lateral work completed. The buyer has to also then have the cash to pay for that work. And then once it's completed, you have to, per the addendum, provide all the documentation to the city to get your money back. And there have been circumstances where buyers have moved in, they've paid the deposit, they just get busy in life, and oops, they missed the 6-month window. And now the city's got that $5,500 bond, and you cannot get it back, and you still have to pay for the work. So, if your buyer's gonna do something and take on responsibility, you as the agent really should be making sure that you follow up with them after and after. If they decide not to do it, okay. But, you really want to make sure that if they put money out, they're responsible, that they take it on.
And do you have a fiduciary liability if you're bugging them about doing it?
No, it doesn't create a fiduciary. Question is, do you have a fiduciary obligation to check in with, or if you have checked in with them, is there a fiduciary obligation created? And I would say no, there's not. You can't create a fiduciary obligation like that. But certainly, their own agent during the transaction has to advise them of what they are obligated to. So as a buyer's agent, you could be held to having failed to inform the buyer that they had obligations.
Yeah, so just the follow-up is the courtesy thing, and why not follow up with your buyers anyway?
Yep, good idea.
Okay, what else have we got?
So we talked about the rental questionnaire issue, which is in the San Francisco contract. It's clear that if that the seller needs to provide a copy to be completed by the tenant, and that if the tenant fails to complete it and return it, that they have no obligation to get it to the buyer. Whereas in the CAR contract, it just says that the estoppels are to be delivered. So I'm not sure how you accomplish that with a difficult tenant.
You don't, and potentially the buyers could walk away. The other one is the UST paragraph in San Francisco. So again, that is an ordinance. So you can write a non-contingent offer with no inspections and absolutely nothing. You can still go ahead and order the underground storage tank if the other side haven't provided it, because it's a city ordinance. And then if you find one, you just present it to the other side, and they'll be really happy to find out that you didn't have any inspections, but you complied with the ordinance, and that the seller is now responsible to resolve that before close of escrow.
That's right. So I've had listing agents that fell into the trap of wanting to be diligent and wanting to cross all the T's and dot all the I's. And so they order a tank inspection, and then a tank is located. And then they have the obligation of explaining to their client why, without the authorization from their client, they ordered an inspection that now obligates the seller, if they don't sell it to a buyer who takes on that responsibility, they have to take the tank out. And it could be tens of thousands of dollars. So you have to be very careful with that.
Yeah. And even if you do get one, several years ago, I had one that was down in Soma, and there was a tank inspection provided, but it was a company I wasn't particularly sure about. And it had been from many years ago. So we ordered another one, and the guy went out and did the test, because they go out without you. And they came back and said, oh, there is a tank in front of the building. And then we went back, and turned out the HOA knew about it and never did anything about it. And then after a couple of weeks of figuring it all out, it turned out that the driveway into this brick building that's down in Soma, the actual entrance to the driveway to get down to the building, belonged to the building next door. And the tank was actually in front of the driveway. So the HOA was not responsible. The other building next door had never been sold, and the neighbor was just ignoring it. So we did get to proceed, but you don't always guarantee that someone who does a tank inspection is going to know where the lot lines are. And we can't decide where lot lines are. So it was a little bit of investigation to go back and figure it out. But yeah, you never know where they are.
In a case like that, the neighbor does not have to.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, the way the law is written in San Francisco, once a property owner becomes aware that there is a tank on their property, they must within 30 days file for a permit for removal of the tank. And so even if it's the neighbor and you just disclosed it to them, they're not going to be a very friendly neighbor probably, but they are now under the requirements of the law to start dealing with their tank.
Yeah. And apparently this neighbor had known about it for years and still had never filed the paperwork, but it's not part of the building. It's not part of the HOA. And so other than that it was disclosed to them, there's nothing else that we could do to represent as the buyer on the other side of the market as a seller.
Okay.
Item 3H, verification of down payments and closing costs.
Yeah, this is an interesting one between the two contracts. So the San Francisco contract has basic language in it that states that the buyer is representing, by delivering their offer, that they have the cash and wherewithal to handle the down payment and the closing costs of the sale of the property. That's not the way the CAR contract is written.
No. Well, the CAR, there's a couple of things. So if you're doing cash buyer, there's already a checkbox that defaults there that you're going to provide verification. And you can decide on verification at the top of page 2 which is item 3H, you can put in all sorts of different dates. So the default is set as 3 days. You can check the box for that it's attached, or you can say that it's 21 days. Maybe you don't have the cash because it's at 10/31 and it is going to be all cash, but you can't provide that verification until the other deal is closed or you've got foreign funds coming in. So it gives you a little bit more room on the CAR contracts that kind of like, if you need to get a bit more creative, you can.
Sometimes, just as a side note, when you have a client that you're not sure whether they have the cash that they say they have, one of the things that you can talk with them about is it's nice to be able to provide proof of funds to the seller when we make an offer. And so if you could provide me with proof of funds, that would be helpful. And then maybe you can coax them into delivering information to prove that they actually have the cash that they say they have.
Yeah, and sometimes even on a regular sale, 20% down or 30% down, if you provide that proof, even if the screenshots to the listing agent and more to the seller, when they receive the offers, they're like, well, why did this one person provide me documentation that they've got the money they say they've got? The other people didn't. And so if you're really close, some of those little things, extra little steps you can do can really help you there. And I apologize for the next phrase because we've already talked about the appraisal contingency. Put that on the wrong slide. Who pays? Item 7, the allocation of costs.
Okay, so here we are in the CAR contract under item 7, and it's real. This is actually kind of a nice feature of the CAR contract, is to clearly spell out who pays for what in one location, rather than having it spread out throughout the contract like the San Francisco contract has.
Yeah. So you can go down who's going to pay for the natural hazards, what company it is. The seller may have provided one and you want a different one. So you can figure that one in there. Who's going to pay for what particular reports? You can itemize that. So if they're in the East Bay and Berkeley and you want to get that, the BESO investigation report, you can tag that. And then 7B is the government requirements and or any retrofit requirements. So the standard smoke alarms, carbon monoxide, that's easy. Usually normally the seller's going to do that and it's going to be part of an ordinance. I have noticed that if there is a local addenda to the contract and in that addenda it actually states who's responsible and who's taking responsibility, some of the listing agents don't like you to actually check the box on the contract because it's already on the addendum. And sometimes lenders look less at addendas like the regional addenda, and they really focus and bury down on the contract itself. So if you've got it referenced somewhere else and you feel like everything's covered, you don't necessarily have to check that box.
But on the other hand, if you want to make sure that you can avoid as much conflict as you can, go to this section and look to see that all of the costs have been taken care of. Because if there are unchecked boxes where people were unsure and didn't check anything, then that leaves you with a potential dispute later as to who's going to pay for it. And you can avoid that just by making sure that the initial offering is complete if you're the listing agent, or if you represent the buyer, make sure that you deliver a completed set of who pays for what.
Yeah. I did notice a comment from someone asking about provided pest reports and home inspections. If they've already provided those and your buyers are happy with those, and we'll talk about the contingency removal and the waiver later, you don't have to put in that someone's going to provide you a copy of a pest report if it's already provided. And in many cases, most lenders don't want to have, or most listing agents don't want to have a reference to a pest report in the contract. Because then the lender's probably going to want to see a copy. And where I used to work up in Davis and Sacramento, there wasn't a deal that closed without Section 1 being cleared. And it's just sellers understood.
That's true for Southern California as well.
That whatever was found in Section 1, the seller was going to fix before close of escrow. And sometimes most of Section 2 items, because we used to have a request for repairs. And it was considered standard practice.
How long was escrow?
30 days. Yeah, most sellers kind of knew, but again, most sellers in that market didn't even know what was going to be on the pest report until the buyer did it. Because, the buyers were left to do whatever inspections they wanted to do. I think it's better than San Francisco that we actually provide a lot of this information. And then you can make a judgment on which inspector it is, how thorough you think they are. Do you need a second inspection? Do you just do the walkthrough with that inspector? And then pre-inspections for buyers for me, particularly is a contentious thing, because I just take that if you're a Zephyr listing agent and you have another Zephyr agent who does a pre-inspection, well, the brokerage now knows about 2 inspections. But I, as the listing agent, would only know about 1 of them because it's prior to the contract. What happens if something in that inspection is a disclosure issue? And so it could potentially put Zephyr on the hook for a liability, and me as the listing agent would be a little bit of a conflict. So I'm personally very keen on walkthroughs or verbal visual inspections by another inspector. But, you know, and other people take a different opinion.
One of the things that you might be asking yourself, well, why would Southern California or Sacramento have Section 1, a requirement that Section 1 work be completed prior to close? And one of the things that I've been told over time is that places like Sacramento and Southern California are significantly drier than Northern California. And so what ends up happening is they don't have reports like we have here. They don't have dry rot so as extensive as we have here because they're a much drier climate. And so in those locations, it's not really as difficult typically to resolve the Section 1 requirement as it is. It might be a $70 or $100 or $150,000 issue in Northern California, and it might be very uncommon to exceed $10,000 in Southern California or Sacramento because of the dry rot.
And from a risk perspective of lenders, you know, there's a lot of the state which is much more affordable than we are now. And so when you've got someone who's buying a property at $200,000, if there's a $10,000 PES report, that's a big deal to a buyer to find $10,000 to do the repairs. And the lender wants to protect the property, so they're going to want to make sure Section 1 is cleared up by the seller who's going to have some money. In San Francisco, when you're buying a $3 million house, if you have a $10,000 PES report, you kind of like, well, you know, that's what it is. And if you want to fix it later, you might want to fix it later. And the people have got the cash. It's a bit like, you know, HOA controls.
We have a question. What if they've included pest, JCP, et cetera, in disclosure packages? Do we need to check these on the contract? That's an interesting question. You could handle this a number of different ways. You could either make a reference to the disclosure package, although you probably want to be careful of what the lender might pick up on and then insist on receiving. But I think that the main thing is that if they're in the disclosure package, then I don't know how much it matters whether we've checked boxes or whether we've referred to them, as long as the buyer has signed them and we have copies.
Right. What else have we got? Yeah, so be careful when using, if you're a San Francisco agent, using CAR contracts, because there are normals for each area, and you can get a copy of what the standard normal things are from the title company if you want to check, or you can check in with your manager. But people can decide for other parties to pay. You don't have to follow normal procedures. I mean, you don't have to in San Francisco. You could say that I, the buyer, want to pay the commission and I'm going to offer you a lesser price, and I want to pay the commission and I want to pay the transfer tax, because they want that as an investment property to have as a potential write-off in the future.
It's a common error that I've seen where out-of-area agents that are unfamiliar, and this pertains to from any area to any area. If you go to a different area, the traditions are different, like, for instance, transfer tax. And as a listing agent in San Francisco, I've received offers that the buyer will pay half the transfer tax without any request. And so that's great. Okay, let's accept that, because that's a term we're not used to, and it's an added benefit to our clients as sellers. But it's a wake-up call that when you're working in an area that you're not used to, that you need to make sure that you understand what the local customs for expenses are.
And then San Francisco contract has defaults set in. Prorations are for everything that's involved in the contract. In the CAR contract, you can delineate who's going to pay move-in fees, move-out fees, who's going to pay for the documents from the HOA. So it's kind of like, again, another reason if you're in San Francisco, just use the San Francisco contracts, because everything's going to be preset. And then TICs, premiums on the insurance. You know, there's kind of, I think really that's maybe more down to group loans, if there was any real group loans left, because potentially the seller can get their portion back. And they can, if they've got reserves that are in there for their prepaid taxes, and even if fractional financing, if they have if TIC group has prepaid property taxes, and that's part of a separate reserve account, you could argue that your seller needs to get their portion back because that's their money. It's not HOA money, it's prepaid taxes. And so you need to figure that one out very carefully and think through that. I think most people seem to just think sellers seem to just leave what they prepaid in there, but they could take that back if they wanted to.
So this also reminds me that one of the very first terms in the San Francisco contract, which is describing the property, allows you to describe a TIC % interest in the whole property, which is not something that exists in the CAR contract. So that's kind of a very basic difference in the very start of the contract as to what you're buying, because TICs are kind of unusual, and shared ownership and use of a property is kind of a nuance to San Francisco.
Yeah, and it's the whole property address that goes in. So it's not 1252 Fulton, it's 1250 to 1256 Fulton Street, and then a percentage of that building. So, and a lot of listing agents can get that wrong when they put it in the MLS because they just want to show a single address because it makes it look like a condo. So you get more potential buyers through. There's a reason for everything. It's not trickery, and sometimes it's just ignorance. They don't realize. And then when it comes, so we're still on item 7 here. So on top of page 3 on the CAR contracts, 7B2 and then items 1 and 2. So the first part is basically who's going to pay the cost of compliance for other minimum mandatory government inspections. So this is like the water and energy and those kind of things. So quite often, sewer laterals. So quite often the seller can be asked to do that work. But then the second part of that, item 2, part 2, a lot of times you leave that blank and you leave that open to negotiation because you don't know necessarily what that investigation is. And it may also be referenced again in an addendum to the contract that, like in the East Bay, it may have already checked that the seller will complete the work, or some really nice agents pre-fill it for you with the buyer will take on the responsibility for doing the sewer lateral and the water and energy. Of course, you don't have to use that addenda. You can swap out and don't have to use the one from the disclosure pack, but they're clearly indicating the strongest preference for what their sellers are looking for.
Do we have a question here?
No, statement from one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the TICs quite often, you have the equivalent of the HOA dues, and then you also have a different part of that, which is your property taxes. So there are listing agents who will just put in the first part, so they're collecting $300 a month, but actually it's $750 a month because the other $450 is for the current property taxes. And remembering that as soon as your client purchases, the TIC, if they're smart, are going to give you, as soon as you close, they're going to give you an updated monthly amount based on your purchase price. So again, if you're representing a buyer on a TIC, you can give them an estimate of what that additional cost may be. But be careful on that, because suddenly your buyer's thinking it's $350 a month, and then it should have been $750 a month. And that's right, they purchased it for more money than the prior sale. So now they're paying $1,000 a month. It's still $350 for just the management of the building, but the rest is their property taxes of their portion. So, they may be asked to refund that. Personally, I've done that where I kind of, as part of the contract, and at closing, it's like, well, actually, no, you need to pre-fund your 6 months up front, which is what everyone else has done. And part of the closing cost now comes an additional property tax bill that they need to fund into the TIC, and can be a bit of a shock to the buyer sometimes. So prep your buyers for that one.
All right. Paragraph 7.
Let's move on. Yeah, I kind of think, again, that's just the
check boxes on costs.
Check boxes on costs. Who's going to do, so that's item D. So it's item 7D. Who's going to pay county, city, HOA transfer fees? That's kind of like, you really want to make sure if you're going to share it 50-50. I was always told to split 50-50. You can just put 50/50. But I think, it's the more wording you can put in there to clearly define that it's split 50%, 50%. I think that's just makes it a little bit clearer, but really be careful. And again, you could have a box that, pre-funding the HOA fee, especially for a TIC. Although hopefully you won't write a CAR contract on a TIC, but talking to the other week on the TIC with Andy Serkin doing units in other parts of the state now with, buildings of 300 and 400 units. It's going to become really, really interesting how they manage this. So,
Moving on to item 9 of the CAR contract, and we talked about this to some extent. Tenant occupied property, the CAR contract calls for it to be delivered vacant, and obviously that's an issue in any rent controlled area, including San Francisco. I think we talked.
Yeah, we've covered that. Yeah. Condition of property.
It used to be that the San Francisco contract had a inspection contingency that you had to initial to have the inspection. And that's not true anymore. This is one of the upgrades to the San Francisco contract that mirrors the CAR contract. And what it does is it now has a boilerplate that you are entitled to a property inspection on the property. And it's called condition of property, which is the same in both contracts. Interestingly, so the CAR contract has an as-is addendum, huh? Or
Yes, as-is clause in, whereas in San Francisco, if you want to really affirm the as-is, there is the as-is addendum, which of course you can put in your disclosures and everything's as-is, but if they have an inspection contingency and they find something, it's not really as-is because they can ask you for money. It's still as-is. They're not asking you to fix it. They're just going to ask you for $50,000 to fix the problem.
Yeah, unless you, interestingly enough, most as-is clauses are very vague and they're almost useless. The only as-is term that would have impact is one that specifically states that that the property is not guaranteed and that no costs will be funded by the seller to the buyer. But even in those cases, like Matthew says, you can still come back and ask for it later. There's no reason why you can't ask for it. And for that matter, in California, there's no such thing as a true as-is addendum when it comes to disclosure. You can't waive disclosure requirements. If you're not exempt from disclosures, you must disclose. And even if you sign an as-is addendum, it doesn't mean anything. You still have to disclose.
And if you don't, they can come back and sue you.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, especially in a circumstance where it's even a trustee potentially, but it's a family member and they knew about something and they didn't tell anyone. It's still, even though they're exempt from a lot of disclosures, if they know a material fact, they should disclose it.
Yeah, actually, interestingly enough, the law about transfer disclosure statements is that if you're exempt, what that means is that you're exempt from completing the form transfer disclosure statement for sellers. It doesn't mean that you are exempt from making a material disclosure. Everyone must make a material disclosure if you're aware of it, regardless of whether you're exempt from completing the form or not. And there's actually a CAR form, I believe, that allows you to make a disclosure when you're not completing the transfer disclosure statement.
Yeah, and it's much better to don't provide a copy of the TDS and write exempt across it, because you've actually now provided the form with a list of questions that haven't been answered. So the exposure there is potentially for the seller. So just provide the exempt form. It's a one-page form. If they are exempt, there's certain key questions that they still have to answer by law. And then it clearly states across it, if you know any other material facts, these need to be disclosed. And it's just provide the form that's provided for us that says you're exempt. Obviously, the San Francisco seller disclosure is not an addendum to the TDS. And I think we've covered that in other trainings, but so that's kind of a requirement. And if you've got a trustee who doesn't want to provide that, then you can actually have an addendum which says that the seller isn't going to provide the San Francisco seller disclosure. But again, they still have to answer, if there's a material fact they know, they still have to disclose it. Right. Contingency periods, we touched a little bit earlier, right at the beginning. So paragraph 14 on the CAR contract pretty much has everything pulled together there, what's going to be involved, and all wrapped together in the predominantly 7 days for the sellers to provide all documents. Buyers have up to 17 days. You can shorten that contingency.
Is that 14?
14, yeah.
14.
And you can shorten. So the other thing with the CAR contract, even if you've removed your condition and you don't want to have an inspection and you've provided a waiver, the contract still allows you to do any and all investigations during the first number of days you have this. If it's left at default, The buyer can still do any investigation they like during the first 17 days, and the seller has to provide access.
So let's repeat that, because a lot of people, especially who are used to older versions of the San Francisco contract, think that, well, if they don't have the contingency, then they don't get the right to inspect. You can refuse entry, and that's not true. If they want to have entry to inspect the property, they may. Now, I asked the CAR attorney, why did you do that? Why would you allow somebody entry to the property that has no contingency? And he said, it's intentional. The idea is that if a buyer chooses to walk away and leave their deposit funds as liquidated damages because of something they discovered, they can do that. It's not a contingency of the contract. It just, if they decide that they want to walk away and leave the money, they can do that. So he said that that's a concept that's intentional, to allow buyers to inspect the property and still walk away, even though they're going to lose money.
Yeah. And of course, that is on a primary residential 1 through 4, not an investment property, because liquidated damages doesn't cover investment properties. So be careful for some of those people who are using the San Francisco contract or the state contract.
On a 5+ unit.
On a 5+ unit, or it's a 2-unit building and they're never going to live in it, and it's a pure investment property. Their attorneys say that you are not, the liquidated damages clause is probably not going to cover you. And so they could potentially go for bigger losses from you. They could sue you for more money than the 3%, because it's not a residential 1 through 4 as an owner occupied primary residence.
And for that matter, you should watch out on new development contracts for new developments of condominiums, for instance, because occasionally there is a developer that is arrogant enough to put a clause in liquidated damages that says that if there are provable additional damages, that the seller can continue to pursue you for more than the 3%, which was shocking to me the first time I came across that.
Yeah, they're good at putting things in there.
Yes.
And I think the last thing this slide really is, so to defaults for notice for seller or buyer actions. Both contracts primarily say 2 days. There is San Francisco contract is written, it's just 2 days, and there's nowhere to alter that checkbox. You can't change it to 3 days or change it to 1 day. It's just written in. And the CR contract is an option. There's a checkbox there, and you can do the default, which is 2 days, or you can do something else. If you shorten it, you may or may not be able to enforce that. Because it may be considered basically not giving enough time for a standard contract for someone to respond to you. And then the other difference is demand to close escrow. So in San Francisco contract, it's still the standard 2 days. You can provide it up to 2 days prior. Remember, it's 2 days prior, so you don't provide it on the 3rd day prior, because
then it's not enforceable.
Then it's not enforceable. Yeah. So, and that's happened before, where someone's even canceled a contract, and it turns out that the demand to close escrow was issued a day early, and therefore, even though they canceled the contract, they weren't out of contract because the demand was wrong. And then on the CAR contracts, the demand is to close escrow as default is at 3 days. So if you shorten that, again, if the state said that 3 days, they consider 3 days is the requirement, and then you could provide longer, and what really that box is there for. If you shorten it to 2 days, again, it may not be enforceable from the court. So just be careful on the CAR contract. They do have an extra day there. And let's see what we got next. Continuation of contingencies. Again, the contingency, you're not out of contract if someone doesn't remove a contingency. And even if you've given them a notice to perform,
you're beyond the deadline, but
yeah.
but your contract is still your contract.
Yeah. And the seller can give a notice, 2-day notice to cancel, and you might not cancel on day 3. You might not cancel on day 4. It may just be something that sometimes buyers and agents and selling agents get together and go, okay, the lender's getting a little slow and they need a nudge. Can you provide me that notice? Because it's going to, the lender's saying, give me that, and I can push it to the top of the
That's interesting. I've never used it for that purpose, but that's a great purpose.
I've used that before. So, but it does put your buyer in a precarious situation, because what happens if suddenly they get a better offer, and then they can cancel on you? But, if you need that extra push, and sometimes it's just to get it through before the weekend, you could do that. That does bring up for me an interesting point, because I called CAR, and to confirm this on someone's question is, when it's an actionable item on a contract, when you're looking at days and you're counting days, obviously all contracts are days of the week, and we all understand that. But removing a contingency or providing proof of something does not include a Saturday, a Sunday, or any public holiday. So even if you have an inspection contingency that's due to be removed on a Saturday, and Monday is a public holiday, you can't actually provide a notice to perform because it's now Monday. So you can't actually provide the notice to perform until Saturday. You can't provide it on Thursday because they can't action you can't action it on a Saturday.
So it has to be the following Tuesday, if it's a holiday.
If it's a holiday, it'll be the following Tuesday, and therefore you can't give the notice to perform until Sunday, which is 3 days later than you thought it was. So you've got to be really, really careful.
So you have to be careful in timing your notices to make sure that they comply with the requirement that a seller not have to perform a requirement like this over a holiday or weekend.
Yeah, and there's 2 clauses in this California contracts talking about timelines, and I wouldn't say they're contradictory, but they're a little convoluted, and it doesn't make it very clear. So, and I actually talked to 2 different people at CAR because I wasn't sure about the first answer, so I called back and got a different one.
You got a different answer?
No, I got the same answer.
Oh, okay.
I got a different attorney. I called the next day because I was just like, this doesn't seem quite right to me. But apparently that's the case. And so I don't know, would you consider that the same enforcement under the San Francisco? Put you on the spot here.
Yeah, I would.
Yeah. So that's what they interpret the state law to be. So we have to be extra careful about those things. And then, buyer can remove a condition until up to the point of termination. So if they haven't actually removed the condition, again, we all have condition removal forms. This is one for the CAR contract and this one for the SFAR contract. Even if you write non-contingent offer and you've signed all the disclosures, technically they haven't removed any conditions unless they provide you a contingency removal form, because it states all contingencies must be explicitly removed in writing.
That's right.
So don't just think that I've given all the disclosures and don't get caught out that, actually the buyer's removed no conditions at all. That's why we added the extra line in the SFAR contract, where you check the box, the condition removal form is attached, and attach it.
There were creative agents that were doing that before that box existed, but
Yep.
now the box exists so that everybody can use that easily. And if you want to make a non-contingent offer, I hope that you have pre-inspections, or that you have knowledge of the property, or you have a very knowledgeable buyer, like a general contractor who's buying, before you remove conditions in advance like that.
Yep. And again, in the San Francisco contract, because the appraisal's wrapped into the financing, if you are going to use that, just don't check the financing and don't check the appraisal box on the contingency removal form when you present it with the offer, because you don't want to check the appraisal box because now you've actually removed the appraisal. So don't fall into that mistake. And then seller can cancel with 48 hours notice. So if the seller wants to do a cancellation, both contracts allow you to present your notice to perform 2 days prior to the contingency removal. We kind of covered that, but just again, you can do it. You don't have to wait until the timeline. You hit the timeline to give the notice.
We were talking about, before this session started, you and I were talking about the fact that there's a paragraph, I think, in the CAR contract that calls for seller having the right to terminate if they have not received a reply from the buyer within 3 days, I think it was.
That's actually item 45 on the San Francisco contract. That new, what was the law? What did they call it? It's the new Financial Crimes Enforcement Act, which is we've incorporated into the San Francisco contract. So if it's an all-cash buyer, the escrow title company.
FinCEN complaint 46.
46. So the title company, if it's an all cash, needs to send or should be sending the buyer a request for information of where is the money coming from. So it's not drug money, or it's, it's not been coming from not just their own money. And they have to provide that. And they have to provide that within 3 days. And if they don't, the seller has a right to cancel. It doesn't say you have to give a notice to perform, but we were discussing beforehand.
We were discussing that there's also a paragraph in the contract that says if the seller wants to terminate anything in here, they have to give notice. So my opinion is, even though there's kind of a conflict between those paragraphs, one says you can just cancel after 3 days. Because the termination paragraph is there, I believe you have to give notice. You have to give 2 days notice that you intend to cancel if you want to cancel.
So if you've got a listing and you've got a buyer who's you accepting a contract that is all cash, communicate with your title and escrow officer and make sure what day are they issuing that notice to the buyers. So therefore you can respond or follow up to make sure A, if they have responded, and if they haven't, then issue them the notice to perform. And then at that point you can actually cancel. So.
Can I just clarify? So let's say the 15th is when they have to have responded to you. And so then that 3 days is the notice, that would be the 12th, but you wouldn't give them the notice to perform until the 13th.
Correct.
Okay,
Because you can't issue any notice prior to 2 days.
great, okay.
The point is just to be careful with timing of your notice again, that you not give it prematurely.
If you are going to remove contingencies, and you're deciding not to have any further inspections, we do have in the San Francisco contracts, we have the paragraph where you can just initial to say I'm waiving my inspections. But that's not enough to cover you, and it's not enough to cover us as the brokerage, and it's not enough disclosure to your buyer. So your buyer should also be completing the waiver of inspections form.
Right.
There's multiple places to initial that. The first one is we're advising you to do a home inspection, and even if the seller's provided one, they need to initial that. The same for the pest inspection. And then the third box is there are provided reports by the seller, and you need to complete who was the pest inspection, what date it was completed, the same for a home inspection. And in the circumstances, quite often there's only room for 3 boxes here. So you might have 7 inspections coming from the seller. So my thought was just put see seller disclosures and the date of the seller disclosures. And then there's a 4th place they should be initiating, because every inspection that I've seen as a home inspection or a pest inspection, even if it's clear, is going to have a statement that says there is further inspection required. We couldn't see past the drywall. We couldn't see past the seller's stored items. So that is the last item for the buyers to initial, is saying we have seen these reports, and they're telling us you need further investigation because we can't see everything. And your buyers need to initial that to say they're waiving their right to complete those further inspections.
Which is risky.
And it's very risky. And in this,
I had a contract once where the pest inspection called for further inspection under the stairs. And this is many years ago. And the under the stairs work that was found on further inspection was $30,000. Today's money would probably be $60,000 or $70,000 to repair those stairs. That's a huge item. And you don't want your buyer to come back to you after the close of escrow and say, I thought it was okay to remove this contingency and not further inspect, and now I've got $70,000 worth of damage. So we have to make sure that when we have the dialogue with our clients, that they're aware that when they waive their inspections like that, there are risks, and they're taking them.
yeah, even if they've done their own inspections, if
That's right.
you provide this form as well, if they do their own follow-up pest inspection and they have that right and they do it, they're going to still call for further investigation. It may be test holes, it may be under the stairs, it may be they can't see past the drywall in the garage because the city made them cover it with drywall, and you don't know what's under there, they can't see it. So again, they still need to sign that form so they're aware that you're reaffirming, I can't see past the drywall, now become the inspector. You're saying you're okay with that.
Right.
And what if they aren't?
Then they need to do further inspections.
That means taking the drywall down.
And that you would have to then get, like doing test holes, you have to get seller permission to do test holes. And if you needed to do some further investigation, like the drywall has got some discoloration and it's all puffed out and you want to be able to do, you can ask the seller to give you permission to cut off that drywall and investigate behind it. They may tell you to go take a jump in this market, but they might not. They might get, you know what? Okay, the seller will go, okay, well, this was the best offer, and maybe it's 50,000 more than the other person. Let's let them open up the wall.
Now, if you represent the seller in a situation like that, a typical term that we apply to allowing a buyer to do destructive work is to repair the destruction after they're done. So if they've opened up a wall, they have to close it back. They have to hire somebody to close it back up again.
And then the result needs to be part of the disclosure.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
The result needs to be part of the disclosure.
Yeah, especially if you cancel. Now you have to provide that additional information to everyone else. So even if they were in a backup position, and maybe that's now going to, if you cancel, then that's going to be a new disclosure on
New
your San
disclosure
Francisco contract.
for the backup. Yeah.
You have 5 days for the person in backup to actually review it and sign off on it, even though they maybe wrote a non-contingent offer also. So yeah,
Good
so
points.
it's a risky thing, but also your seller, do they really want to sell it with someone to someone when they're denying them to do an inspection? It's not going to go well afterwards, probably. I think we actually covered.
Be sure to use, you can't stress this enough. If you're using a CAR contract, you should use the CAR forms. If you're using a San Francisco contract, you should use the San Francisco forms.
Yeah.
Because there are references in some of the supplemental forms to the original form, and if you're using the wrong series of forms, you're not going to be referencing properly.
Yeah, and I see a reference.
One addendum though is in the CAR, not in the.
That's correct.
Yeah.
The addendum is generic enough that they allow it to be used for both.
Yeah, and I notice there's a thing up there that says 24 hours, and so ignore that 24-hour statement. So, actually, no, yeah, if you do issue 24 hours, CR won't be valid. We covered that earlier. I think we've covered everything else on that beforehand. Again, repeating at the end, the sellers have to provide removed all their contingencies and provided all documents on the CAR contract. It's a little different on the San Francisco because they're broken out separately.
14D, continued.
So
We talked about making sure that you fulfilled your obligations before you demand that the other party fulfill their obligations.
yeah. And again, 3-hour report, sometimes you're waiting on a 3-hour report or an updated 3-hour report in San Francisco. Because you receive it, you're going on the market, you get it the day before you go live, and then you realize the city's missed a whole bunch of stuff. That you've got copies of permits that are closed, and you've got proof of that, but they're showing them all as expired. So you're going to continue to carry on marketing the property, but you might be waiting for an updated report for 2 weeks once you get that cleared away. And so in the CR contract, he would leave you exposed because you the seller, haven't provided all disclosures. So therefore, you can't cancel on the buyer.
The result of failure to fulfill all of your obligations on your side of the contract and then demanding that the other side fulfill their obligations is that you could argue back and forth for days and then come to the conclusion that, oh, they're right, we haven't fulfilled all our obligations. So now we've wasted a whole bunch of time and we have to go back, fulfill our obligations, and then we can make the demand. So better to be sure that you fulfilled all your obligations before you start down that path.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to the whole combative agent compared to the collaborative agent. Is what is the problem and how are we going to move forward from this? Instead of digging the heels in and saying, you haven't done this, you really need to have that conversation and maybe come to your manager also beforehand and make sure that your party has completed everything they should have done before you start demanding, because you can get yourself in a waste days and days going backwards and forwards arguing.
Yeah. One of the ways that I'll give you as an example, if a seller wants to terminate a buyer for not fulfilling their obligations, and it's a tenant-occupied property, or if it's a condominium, then with tenant-occupied property and condominiums, there's a whole lot of requirements of a seller to a buyer. With an HOA, it's a year's worth of minutes and bylaws and budgets and reserve studies and all that stuff. And if you haven't delivered even one of those, it could delay the whole process of trying to work with the buyer for them to fulfill their obligations. Also with rent control, did you get estoppels back? Did you deliver them to the buyer when you received them? If you haven't fulfilled one of your obligations, then you've delayed the whole process to keep the contract moving.
Yep. I think when you remove your contingencies, what are the potential effects? And we just want to make sure that when you're using the contingency removal forms, remove the specific contingencies. The CR one's a little simpler in some ways because there's an easy box to check at the bottom. It's like, I remove everything except and then it's got a check box for an appraisal and financing, and you can put other items in. It's not a place to start negotiating repairs or I'm removing the conditions subject to this. Mm-hmm. Figure that out beforehand.
Well, and that brings up that the CAR contract actually has a form for request of repairs. which the San Francisco contract does not. And so you can formalize the process, and the result is pretty much the same. If the seller refuses or only agrees to do partial work, then the buyer has a decision to make as to whether they want to proceed with that understanding.
Yeah. And the plus of using a request for repairs form, and you can use it on the San Francisco contract if you wish to, that it is not an addendum to the contract. So it's a negotiation between the buyer and seller to come to an agreement of what's going to proceed for the buyers to be able to remove that condition. Once you come to that agreement, you can then write up an addendum confirming that invariably in San Francisco, and even in Marin and other areas, that it may be the seller's going to provide a credit for $10,000 towards closing costs, and we're going to adjust the price by $30,000. What you don't want to have is the addendum saying the seller's going to give $10,000 for the pest report item, blah, 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 because suddenly the lender's going to want to see the pest report. So, so it is something that you don't have to, from what I asked of CAR, it's not a requirement to provide that to the lender. You have to provide every addendum, but the negotiation is not an addendum.
So that's a smart way that the CAR forms are set up to not create controversy with the parties involved. What they do is it's a side request for funds that can either be accepted or rejected or partially accepted. And then from there, we know how we proceed from there. But
yeah,
it's a nice, clean way to deal with the request for repairs.
Yeah, I see a lot of emails in San Francisco between agents trying to work out what's going to happen. But I personally, I think it's a little bit more influential on the seller if you've got a buyer to actually provide a form that the buyer signed. It's like presenting a verbal offer. There is no offer. It's kind of like, it has a little bit more weight behind it if you've got a real form and some signatures on it.
Sabrina says, why do other forms require verification of condition after walkthroughs? And I don't see the rest of that. After walkthroughs, but Zephyr doesn't. Why do other forms?
Firms.
Oh, why do other firms, require verification of condition after walkthroughs, but Zephyr doesn't? That's a good question.
I don't know. I always like my buyers to sign it when I was working with them.
Yeah, I mean, what we've done is if the buyer is happy, then the buyer acknowledges that they're happy, and then there's not a list of items that they would use on a standard walkthrough. I think it's probably a useful tool to do a walkthrough checklist.
Yep.
So I would actually recommend it. So Zephyr is now recommending it.
We'll find out if it becomes a needed form later on. Close of escrow. We talked a little bit about the termination earlier. It's just reaffirming CAR contract. The default is 3 days to give notice. You can only give notice 2 days prior, but it is to the event, but it is a 3-day notice to perform. It's a little bit backwards because really you're going to give them an extra day by default there. And the CAR contract, it is standard a 2-day actionable item. Again, the weekends, holidays, all of that come into effect because you can't close on the weekends.
Right.
Joint escrow instructions on the CAR contract.
Okay, so this is kind of an interesting difference in how business is done in Southern California, where the attorneys are, who draft the CAR contract. And so they see the contract as instructions to escrow. And so you actually submit your contract to escrow as instructions. And the escrow agent actually refers to the purchase contract for their instructions, which is different than the way we do it in San Francisco, where we give separate instructions from the purchase contract. It's our opinion in San Francisco that the escrow agent has no business knowing what all the terms of the agreement are. All they need to know is what the instructions from the buyers and the sellers are. So it's a different approach to the same thing. One's not right, one's not wrong, but know that when you're using the CAR contract, it identifies itself as instructions to escrow.
Yeah, and in Southern California, they actually, some escrow officers will do it up here in different counties. They'll actually fill in the CAR contract section at the bottom, but they're meant to have their license numbers, their addresses, phone numbers, email addresses, which also could be useful on wire fraud cases because then the escrow officer has provided the form, but then who provided the contract to the escrow officer? So I don't know.
And one interesting thing that I noticed is that you can talk all day long about how you're delivering instructions to escrow, like if there's a provision in the CAR contract that if the seller notifies the buyer that they're in default and the buyer doesn't respond within 10 days, then the seller can then instruct escrow to release the funds to them. Well, you can't do that. I mean, you're not going to find an escrow office that's going to just release funds. What's going to happen is the escrow office is going to talk to their attorneys, and their attorneys are going to say, don't release the funds unless we have mutual agreement, because we're a fiduciary to both parties. And so you have to be careful of those passive terms in the CAR contract. But like I say, I don't think that an escrow office is going to comply with them anyway. You can submit whatever you want, and they're going to follow what their lawyers tell them to follow.
Yeah. And you're going to provide the cancellation form from San Francisco contract or the CR contract, and they're invariably going to provide you their own form. So just remember, if you're going to cancel the contract, call your escrow office first, get their form as well as our contractual form, and provide both. And they're both saying exactly the same thing.
Another example of that is you could go to an escrow office and have a signed power of attorney that is a legitimate power of attorney. And just because you have it, the escrow office may not accept the language of that power of attorney. And they'll say, no, we've got our own form. We've got our own power of attorney, and you got to fill out our version of the power of attorney. And that's just the way it is. If you're going to ask them to comply with something, their lawyers have to approve of it.
Were there any questions there? I didn't see if anything else popped.
I didn't see any other questions.
Okay. We covered it a little bit. There is an addendum, the San Francisco addendum to the CAL contract. Again, it does cover lots of things, and it does clear up many items. But again, it's all the contingencies still get wrapped into that default 7 and 17. It doesn't break them out individually. And so that's the problem that we have representing our buyers and sellers by using it. That's a good one.
You should read and understand any form you are using. You know, there is so much to be learned about transactions. I'm sorry if this sounds boring to you, but by reading the forms. We have a training for new agents in our agent development program called Read the Contract, and it covers the San Francisco and the CAR contracts. And the idea is Matthew and I receive, and all the managers receive, questions that if the agent had actually read the forms that they're using, it would be explained. It's there. The reason our forms are so voluminous is because there's a lot of explanations there. So the best way to understand and use the forms is to read and understand them.
Yeah, and especially if you're a buyer's agent, go back and just reread line by line the TDS, the San Francisco seller disclosure, because I had to do it again recently to answer a specific question for someone. And I was like, oh, I forgot that was in there. Yeah, okay. So it was kind of like, even though I'm seeing the forms all the time, like there are things just refreshing. It is a little boring, but it's also
and plus they update them every 30 days. So.
yeah, just to confuse you.
They don't. It's very occasional that they have an update that quickly. But
and then if you have questions, you have concerns, okay, it may be in the contract, but that's okay. Don't be embarrassed. Just come and ask us anyway. Because invariably we're going to be just like every attorney would, is you go back and you get the form when you read the form. So if you have questions for us and it's specific, provide the contract, provide all the addendums. Don't kind of forget that one addendum. So that's kind of like, because it can change how we respond to the answer.
We have agents that come to us on occasion, and they already know what answer they want. And so they will provide some of the documents, but not all the documents, because they're trying to lean towards that correct answer for them. So please don't work us. Just bring all the documents and we'll review that with you.
Yeah.
Bonnie has a question.
Oh, yeah.
So we will be writing either a San Francisco or CAR contract. And then the only place that what we're looking for exists is like a Zephyr form. And you were saying that if you're using a CAR contract, only use CAR forms, and if you're using a San Francisco, only use. So how do you write those Zephyr forms in so that it's not a conflict?
Well, I don't know where it would be. So the question is, what if there are forms in the Zephyr library that don't exist as CAR or SFAR contracts, which there are. There are examples of them, lots of them. And I don't think there are any natural conflicts. No, all of those forms are additions to, they're either most of them are disclosures. And some of them are forms that allow you to create mutually agreeable additional terms. without using a blank addendum and trying to create the language. We have already created the language for you. But the idea there would not be to conflict with any of the other forms that are being used. Anything that you need or want to use from the Zephyr library, you should go ahead and use them, and there should be no conflict.
Yeah. And if it's something that's a disclosure and you want to incorporate into a CAR contract, because you think maybe you're outside of San Francisco and you need to you want to incorporate one of those forms, you can always just check the box for additional forms and just write in what the form is.
That's true.
Make it a condition of the contract that the seller actually signs it, or the buyer signs it.
And one thing I'll bring up at this point is that if you have a transaction coordinator or an agent on the other side of a transaction at another company that refuses to complete our forms, that's okay. What we want you to do is we want you to still include the form in with the transaction file, but we would mark the form, we would mark a comment or a note that would say presented to a buyer's agent on such and such a date, and they refuse to sign in return. Now, the one thing I will add on to that is don't ask people to sign forms on the last day, on the day that they sign other contract forms. Get them to them early, and better yet, include them in the disclosure package so that they know up front what we're expecting, because it's very difficult. I just had one last week where the agent was asking the other agent to sign and return forms on the very last day before close of escrow. And the client was not really inclined to do it, and I don't blame them, because they just had all these forms that were a surprise to them. They don't really understand them. So avoid that. If cash wire, okay, I've got it here. Mary Jean says, if cash waived from overseas,
Wired.
sorry, I can't read anymore. Sorry. If cash is wired from overseas, who is responsible to check the funds source? Well, certainly, the buyer's agent is the buyer's fiduciary, the seller's agent is the seller's fiduciary. And so if the seller per contract is requiring, which they are in the CAR contract, that there be a verification of funds, then it would be up to the seller, and therefore you as the agent for the seller, to make sure that those verifications come in, even if it's from overseas.
Yeah. If you have financing, the lender's is going to do all of that work for you on your behalf. And why they added in on the San Francisco contract, I can only guess why they added this new FinCEN law in on item 46, which is, so if it is all cash, it becomes the escrow, it's stating it's the escrow title company's responsibility to source those funds and for the buyer to say where it's come from. So they've got a copy of that document, and that's why they have to do it within 3 days, because the lender's already doing that if they have a loan.
I never saw suitcases of cash. I think Bill Drypulcher has seen suitcases of cash brought into escrow to purchase a property. But in today's world, you can't really practically do that. No gold bars, no cash. You actually, because your funds are going to be sourced, because the IRS will not allow funds in excess of $10,000 to transfer into an account of an institution here without all kinds of documentation as to the source of the money.
I think we have a couple of, maybe another question there.
I don't have another question.
No, okay. So why do we encourage people and agents for buyers agents to bring the SFAR contracts on the SF listings? It avoids confusion. It avoids mistakes. It just talks about San Francisco rules, and that's why we do use the state listing agreement, but then we have all the Zephyr addenda and San Francisco Association addenda. It's keeping all forms relevant, contingency removal, notices, all of those things relevant to our contract. So a CAR form, if it's referring to the contract, they're the ones that we really have the duplicates of in San Francisco. So because they're going to refer to our paragraphs rather than the CAR ones. So it's kind of, those are the ones that really you can't cross-reference.
And we want you to be, one of the points that Matthew made is that we want the form that's being used to be the form that you're familiar with, because we don't want you to make mistakes by not knowing additional things that are included or things that were not included because you're used to a different form. And if you're dealing with a property outside of San Francisco, you better get used to the CAR contract. And if you're dealing with property in San Francisco, you better be familiar with the San Francisco contract.
Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons that we have listing agents require or strongly request that any offers that come in on a San Francisco property come in on a San Francisco contract, because that way we protect ourselves for the many transactions we do in San Francisco.
It would take you days to actually kind of write an addendum to correct everything from the CAR to the, and like, it'd be so lengthy. Just so, just counter or provide them the copy if they bring it on the wrong contract. Say, sorry, that's the wrong contract. Here's the 7-page contract. Fill it in.
Yep.
And get it back to me within the hour. And then they're all flustered, and maybe then you can just get the referral fee for representing their client in the future because they didn't get the house. Yeah.
Okay, we're opening this up to questions, which includes our viewing audiences around the world.
Anyone else in here?
Any questions in here? Is it good practice to put a blank SFAR contract in when we are working with potentially agents from out of area? I don't think that's necessary. In a day with zip forms, I don't know that that's really necessary, because everybody that's going to be working on zip forms is going to have access to those forms. But certainly if there's an agent that does not have access and they want to make an offer, I would provide them with a copy of the contract. There's no reason why you shouldn't provide them with a copy of the contract.
I wouldn't put it in the disclosure pack.
That's all the questions I have.
That's it.
Okay, thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you so much.